56 kilobytes L2 cache. Plymouth 0.35 micrometer process technology, 233, 266, 300 MHz, 66 MHz system bus clock rate. Family 6 Model 3. Variants 233, 266, 300 MHz introduced the 7th of May, 1997. Deschutes 0.25 micrometer process technology, 333, 350, 400, 450 MHz, introduced the 26th of January, 1998. 66 MHz system bus clock rate, 333 MHz variant, 100 MHz system bus clock rate for all subsequent models. Family 6 Model 5. Variants 333 MHz introduced the 26th of January, 1998. 350, 400 MHz introduced the 15th of April, 1998. 450 MHz introduced the 24th of August, 1998. 233, 266 MHz, mobile, introduced the 2nd of April, 1998. 333 MHz Pentium 2 overdrive processor for socket 8 introduced the 10th of August, 1998. 300 MHz, mobile, introduced the 9th of September, 1998. 333 MHz, mobile, introduced the 25th of January, 1999. Celeron, Pentium 2 based. Covington 0.25 micrometer process technology introduced the 15th of April, 1998. 242-pin slot 1 SEP, single-edge processor package. 7.5 million transistors. 66 MHz system bus clock rate. Slot 1. 32 kilobytes L1 cache. No L2 cache. Variants 266 MHz introduced the 15th of April, 1998. 300 MHz introduced the 9th of June, 1998. Mendocino 0.25 micrometer process technology introduced the 24th of August, 1998. 242-pin slot 1 SEP, single-edge processor package, socket 370 PPGA package. 19 million transistors. 66 MHz system bus clock rate. Slot 1, socket 370. 32 kilobytes L1 cache. 128 kilobytes integrated cache. Family 6 Model 6. Variants 300, 333 MHz introduced the 24th of August, 1998. 366, 400 MHz introduced the 4th of January, 1999. 433 MHz introduced the 22nd of March, 1999. 466 MHz. 500 MHz introduced the 2nd of August, 1999. 533 MHz introduced the 4th of January, 2000. 266 MHz, mobile. 300 MHz, mobile. 333 MHz, mobile, introduced the 5th of April, 1999. 366 MHz, mobile. 400 MHz, mobile. 433 MHz, mobile. 450 MHz, mobile, introduced the 14th of February, 2000. 466 MHz, mobile. 500 MHz, mobile, introduced the 14th of February, 2000. Pentium 2 Xeon. Chronological entry, introduced the 29th of June, 1998. Pentium 3. Cat-MAI 0.25 micrometer process technology introduced the 26th of February, 1999. Improved PII, IEP6 based core, now including streaming SIMD extensions, SSE. 9.5 million transistors. 512 kilobytes, 512 1024B, 1/2 bandwidth L2 external cache. 242-pin slot 1 SECC2, single edge contact cartridge 2, processor package. System bus clock rate 100 MHz, 133 MHz, B models. Slot 1. Family 6 Model 7. Variants 450, 500 MHz introduced the 26th of February, 1999. 550 MHz introduced the 17th of May, 1999. 600 MHz introduced the 2nd of August, 1999. 533, 600 MHz introduced, 133 MHz bus clock rate, the 27th of September, 1999. Coppermine 0.18 micrometer process technology introduced the 25th of October, 1999. 28.1 million transistors. 256 kilobytes. 512 1024B, Advanced Transfer L2 Cache, integrated. 242-pin slot 1 SECC2, single edge contact cartridge 2, processor package, 370-pin FCPGA, flip-chip pin grid array, package. System bus clock rate 100 MHz, E models, 133 MHz, EB models. Slot 1, socket 370. Family 6 Model 8. Variants 500 MHz, 100 MHz bus clock rate. 533 MHz. 550 MHz, 100 MHz bus clock rate. 600 MHz. 600 MHz, 100 MHz bus clock rate. 650 MHz, 100 MHz bus clock rate, introduced the 25th of October, 1999. 667 MHz introduced the 25th of October, 1999. 700 MHz, 100 MHz bus clock rate, introduced the 25th of October, 1999. 733 MHz introduced the 25th of October, 1999. 750, 800 MHz, 100 MHz bus clock rate, introduced the 20th of December, 1999. 850 MHz, 100 MHz bus clock rate, introduced the 20th of March, 2000. 866 MHz introduced the 20th of March, 2000. 933 MHz introduced the 24th of May, 2000. 1000 MHz introduced the 8th of March, 2000, not widely available at time of release. 1100 MHz. 1133 MHz, first version recalled, later re-released. 400, 450, 500 MHz, mobile, introduced the 25th of October, 1999. 600, 650 MHz, mobile, introduced the 18th of January, 2000. 700 MHz, mobile, introduced the 24th of April, 2000. 750 MHz, mobile, introduced the 19th of June, 2000. 850 MHz, mobile, introduced the 25th of September, 2000. 900, 1000 MHz, mobile, introduced the 19th of March, 2001. Tualatin 0.13 micrometer process technology introduced July 2001. 28.1 million transistors. 32 kilobytes, 32 1024B, L1 cache. 256 kilobytes or 512 kilobytes advanced transfer L2 cache, integrated. 370-pin FCPGA2, flip-chip pin grid array, package. 133 MHz system bus clock rate. Socket 370. Family 6 Model 11. Variants 1133 MHz, 256 kilobytes L2. 1133 MHz, 512 kilobytes L2. 1200 MHz. 1266 MHz, 512 kilobytes L2. 1333 MHz. 1400 MHz, 512 kilobytes L2. Pentium 2 Xeon and Pentium 3 Xeon. PII Xeon variants 400 MHz introduced the 29th of June, 1998. 450 MHz, 512 kilobytes L2 cache, introduced the 6th of October, 1998. 450 MHz, 1 megabyte and 2 megabytes L2 cache, introduced the 5th of January, 1999. PII Xeon introduced the 25th of October, 1999. 9.5 million transistors at 0.25 micrometer or 28 million at 0.18 micrometer. L2 cache is 256 kilobytes, 1 megabyte, or 2 megabytes advanced transfer cache, integrated. Processor package style is single-edge contact cartridge, S.E.C.C.2, or SC330. System bus clock rate 133 MHz, 256 kilobytes L2 cache, or 100 MHz, 12 megabytes L2 cache. System bus width, 64 bits. Addressable memory, 64 gigabytes. Used in two-way servers and workstations, 256 kilobytes L2, or 4 and 8-way servers, 12 megabytes L2. Family 6 Model 10. Variants 500 MHz, 0.25 micrometer process, introduced the 17th of March, 1999. 550 MHz, 0.25 micrometer process, introduced the 23rd of August, 1999. 600 MHz, 0.18 micrometer process, 256 kilobytes L2 cache, introduced the 25th of October, 1999. 667 MHz, 0.18 micrometer process, 256 kilobytes L2 cache, introduced the 25th of October, 1999. 733 MHz, 0.18 micrometer process, 256 kilobytes L2 cache, introduced the 25th of October, 1999. 800 MHz, 0.18 micrometer process, 256 kilobytes L2 cache, introduced the 12th of January, 2000. 866 MHz, 0.18 micrometer process, 256 kilobytes L2 cache, introduced the 10th of April, 2000. 933 MHz, 0.18 micrometer process, 256 kilobytes L2 cache. 1000 megahertz, 0.18 micrometer process, 256 kilobytes L2 cache, introduced the 22nd of August, 2000. 700 megahertz, 0.18 micrometer process, 12 megabytes L2 cache, introduced the 22nd of May, 2000. Celeron, Pentium 3 Coppermine based. Coppermine 128, 0.18 micrometer process technology introduced March, 2000. Streaming SIMD extensions, SSE. Socket 370, FCPGA processor package. 28.1 million transistors. 66 MHz system bus clock rate. 100 MHz system bus clock rate from the 3rd of January, 2001. 32 kilobytes L1 cache. 128 kilobytes advanced transfer L2 cache. Family 6 Model 8. Variants 533 MHz. 566 MHz. 600 MHz. 633, 667, 700 MHz introduced the 26th of June, 2000. 733, 766 MHz introduced the 13th of November, 2000. 800 MHz introduced the 3rd of January, 2001. 850 MHz introduced the 9th of April, 2001. 900 MHz introduced the 2nd of July, 2001. 950, 1000, 1100 MHz introduced the 31st of August, 2001. 550 MHz, mobile. 600, 650 MHz, mobile, introduced the 19th of June, 2000. 700 MHz, mobile, introduced the 25th of September, 2000. 750 MHz, mobile, introduced the 19th of March, 2001. 800 MHz, mobile. 850 MHz, mobile, introduced the 2nd of July, 2000 and...
Yes, the video splits in 1 minute. I have recorded 2 hours 40 minutes. It's 7 p.m. So let's charge the camcorder and continue. And I will try to finish so later. But this camcorder needs some more power. But we have less 1 minute left. So that's 6. That's 8 part videos. The video splits in like 30 seconds, so we not really have much time. But I will start charging the camcorder.